Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about realizing the self is like realizing the I. And what I mean by this is so many seekers are trying to see the self as an object. It's like the I trying to see itself as an object. It is impossible. No matter where you look or how you look. You kind of cross the eyes, roll backwards, whatever. It doesn't matter. You cannot see the I. The I cannot see the I. It's impossible. Likewise, the self never sees itself, never sees the self as an object. Now, somebody might be clever and go, well, if you have a mirror, you can see the I. Well, you're not seeing the I. What you're seeing is a mirror. And assuming that the accurate reflection is the actual I. But you don't know if it's a funhouse mirror and distorted in some way, and maybe that's not really the I that you're seeing. It's distorted in some way. And unless you clearly saw the mirror in its entirety, you wouldn't know if the distortion was there or not. So the reflection may not even be a good representation of what's actually there, if it's distorted sufficiently enough. And so we're not seeing the I, we're seeing a mirror. And this is very akin to what happens when somebody says they experience the self as if prior they did not experience the self, and then suddenly they experience the self, and the experience went away, and they don't experience the self, and they're trying to figure out how to get it back. Or if somebody says they got into the self and then fell out of the self, and now they're trying to figure out how to get back into the self again. They're like, well, how do I stay in the self? Is often how it's phrased. How do I stay in the self? And in this instance, the self they're describing is a reflection. It's not the self. It's a mental objectification. It's an object being experienced. It's not the self. The self is, more accurately, the eternal subject that never becomes the object. The self is all there is in non-duality. And so the self was, prior to that experience of not knowing or experiencing the self, it also was there during the experience of the self, and it was still there after the experience of self went away and there wasn't an experience of self anymore. So that prior misunderstanding of experience of self, the entire time the self was there, whether it was experienced or not. And when it was experienced, it wasn't an experience of the self, but just a reflection, a mental representation, an imagination that we equate with self. But self was there all along. And so the question becomes, how does one know the self? Because we assume that we know things by seeing it. You look at and investigate a dog long enough, you get an idea of what a dog is because you see it. You see how it acts, you see what it looks like. And then you see a cat and you know what a cat is because you see it. And how it acts and its characteristics are totally different than a dog or a person or anything else. Based on what we see, we think we know. But when it comes to the I, how do you know the I? It's not by trying to see it as an object, which is impossible, as I said. And so how do you know the I is always the eternal question. And you know the I by the very fact of seeing. The seeing itself is knowing the I. If there was no seeing, and there was no other sense to be aware of the I, there would be no knowing of the I. If all you had was hearing, for example, and there was no eye, and so there was no seeing, you would never know the eye, even if you had them in their head, because they weren't functioning. The eye could be there, but it couldn't be known as an object because there was no way of seeing it per se. Maybe it could be felt. Oh, there was this squishy mass. But that's just another way of seeing through the fingertips. And so you can go, oh, there's the eye. Well, that's objective seeing. But we're talking about the eye itself. How does the eye know itself? And it's through the very act of seeing. Seeing is knowing the eye. Now, in terms of the self, what is the knowing of the self then? The knowing of the self is being. It's existing. The amming. The constant am. I am. The I gets added on later, of course. It's a mental thought. Conventions of speech would say I am, but let's drop off the I and just go the am. Am. That is knowing the self. Being. Am. That is knowing the self. And just like trying to become aware of the actual seeing of the I you could try to become aware of the seeing of the I, and you can get into some weird scenarios with that, and kind of a pseudo experience as it tries to become an object. Likewise, you could try to become aware of the am or being. But as you try to become aware of the am or being, again, you're trying to objectify it in some way. And it sets up almost a weird echo. It's almost like a feedback loop could happen, where it's like if you showed a recording camera to the TV that the image is being output to, it sets up a feedback loop and the screen goes nuts. Or the old style telephones where the receiver and the speaker were separate. If you put them together, there was a squelch. It would be this loud, noise because of the feedback loop going through, that which is coming out is going back as an input, and it would just go back around and around. And so you might find a similar feedback loop happen as you're trying to become aware of being or am, because another way of saying being or am is awareness itself. Being is awareness itself. If it wasn't aware, it wouldn't know it was being. To be is to be aware. And so trying to become aware of awareness is awareness trying to become aware of awareness. Sets up kind of a feedback loop because you're trying to become aware of that which is aware. And it doesn't work. Now, you can kind of fake it working by throwing up an object, like experiencing the self I'd mentioned earlier. You could have this idea of awareness, a concept in the mind could form of what awareness is, and you could be aware of that. And so you could then suddenly have a feeling of I'm aware of awareness. But then you can be aware of that, so you can be aware of being aware of awareness. And then you can be aware of that, which is being aware of being aware of being aware of awareness. And you could just go into this infinite echo of continually stepping backward and looking at that which you were just looking at, each time creating a new image or concept so you can look at it. But it's so much closer than that. The self is just am, is just being, is just awareness. And it never becomes aware of itself. It is just simply the being, awareness, am itself without being aware of itself. And it sounds kind of contradictory, but it really isn't. It's just being comfortable with the subject never becoming an object. It's being okay with that which aware doesn't become an object of awareness. So you can't look at yourself and then look at yourself looking at yourself. That kind of game you're not doing. You don't bother trying. You're just going, well, the looking itself is the point. The seeing, the awareness, the being, the amness is the point. No more, no less. And that is how the self knows itself. It's not something to grasp. That's the part that so many egos and inner conditioning resists, because that isn't graspable. That doesn't allow the self to be grasped. I've got it. That doesn't happen. It feels somewhat out of reach, not as tangible, because it doesn't become an object that you can grab onto and look and investigate. I mean, if the eye sees something, it's fairly tangible and seems real. It can grasp it. But when it's trying to see itself, there's nothing to grasp. There's nothing for it to grab onto and tangibly go, there, I got it. And so it's giving up this need for something to grasp and just being comfortable, abiding as the awareness, abiding as being, abiding as am, abiding as the seeing. And that is knowing the self. An ever knowing, not based on knowledge. Knowledge is a grasping. Knowledge of self is a way to compartmentalize, conceptualize, put something into a box and fully grasp it. And it becomes something of the past. It's now a piece of data of past experience I can refer to. Knowledge is of the past, and it's of something grasped. And so, knowing the self never becomes knowledge. It's just ever-present knowing, which isn't something that's grasped. Never becomes part of the past, never a concept. Non-conceptual. Anyways, if you got any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.